In the early years of World War II, the Atlantic Ocean became one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Beneath its cold, dark waters, German submarines known as U-boats waited silently along the shipping routes that connected North America to Britain. These submarines had a single mission: destroy the merchant ships carrying food, fuel, weapons, and supplies across the ocean. For the commanders of Germany's U-boat fleet, the strategy seemed simple and devastating. Britain was an island nation, and its survival depended entirely on ships crossing the Atlantic. If enough of those ships were sunk, the country could eventually be starved into surrender, without Germany ever needing to invade. At first, the plan appeared to be working. Merchant convoys moving slowly across the ocean seemed like perfect targets. The ships were large, heavily loaded, and unable to move quickly. At night, U-boats would surface and approach silently across the waves. From a distance, they looked almost invisible against the dark horizon. Submarine captains carefully positioned their vessels and launched torpedoes toward the convoy center, where fuel tankers and cargo ships sailed close together. When the torpedoes struck, the explosions were sudden and violent. Flames shot into the sky, and panic spread through the convoy as sailors struggled to understand where the attack had come from. Before escort ships could respond, the submarines were already slipping away into the darkness. German commanders believed these convoys were fundamentally vulnerable. Even when escort ships were present, the ocean was enormous and submarines were difficult to detect. Many U-boat captains began to see the Atlantic as a hunting ground, where merchant ships could be attacked almost at will. Patrol after patrol returned with reports of burning tankers and sinking cargo vessels. Each successful attack meant fewer supplies reaching Britain, and each loss increased the pressure on the Allied war effort. But the situation, the U-boat commanders believed they understood, was quietly beginning to change. While submarines were achieving success in the early years of the war, Allied naval officers were studying every attack and learning from every loss. They were developing new technologies, new tactics, and a new strategy that would eventually transform the Atlantic into a far more dangerous place for submarines than for the convoys they hunted. The U-boat captains did not yet realize it, but the ocean they believed belonged to them was slowly turning into a trap. And before long, the hunters of the Atlantic would discover that someone had begun hunting them. The early success of the U-boats was not only the result of stealth or luck. It was the product of a carefully designed strategy created by one man, Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of Germany's submarine fleet. Dönitz understood that a single submarine attacking a convoy rarely had enough firepower to destroy many ships before the escorts reacted. Convoys might be slow, but they were not completely helpless, and destroyers and escort ships could chase submarines away if they detected them quickly enough. To solve this problem, Dönitz introduced a new tactic that would soon terrify merchant sailors across the Atlantic. He called it the Wolfpack. Instead of operating alone, U-boats were spread across large patrol lines in the Atlantic Ocean. Each submarine would monitor a section of sea, searching for the smoke or radio signals that might reveal the location of an Allied convoy. When one U-boat finally spotted a convoy, it did not attack immediately. Instead, the submarine shadowed the ships from a distance and radioed their position back to German command. Soon, other U-boats in the region would begin moving toward the target. By the time night arrived, several submarines might be gathering around the convoy like predators circling prey. Then, the attack would begin. And U-boats often surfaced during these assaults because their diesel engines allowed them to move faster on the surface than underwater. In the darkness of night, a surfaced submarine could maneuver among the convoy almost like another ship. From the escort's perspective, it was extremely difficult to distinguish a submarine from a merchant vessel until torpedoes were already in the water. Multiple submarines would strike from different directions. Now launching torpedoes toward the center of the convoy where the most valuable ships sailed. Oil tankers, ammunition ships, and cargo vessels became the primary targets. Explosions would suddenly tear through the formation as torpedoes found their marks. Ships caught fire, others broke apart, and some sank within minutes. Confusion spread quickly among the convoy as escorts rushed from one crisis to another. For the submarine commanders, these attacks were often devastatingly effective. A well-coordinated Wolfpack could sink several ships in a single night before the escorts managed to organize a defense. The Atlantic soon became littered with burning wrecks, and lifeboats filled with survivors drifting in the cold waves. By 1941 and 1942, the Wolfpack strategy was producing remarkable results. German commanders began believing that the convoy system itself was flawed. They saw merchant ships traveling together not as a defensive measure, but as an opportunity, a concentrated target where multiple ships could be destroyed in one coordinated strike. The U-boat crews were becoming increasingly confident. From their perspective, the Atlantic Ocean had become a battlefield where submarines held the advantage. But while the Wolfpacks were celebrating their victories, Allied naval planners were carefully studying how these attacks worked, and they were already searching for ways to break the U-boat's dominance of the Atlantic. For Britain, the convoys crossing the Atlantic were far more than groups of merchant ships moving between continents. They were the lifeline of the entire nation. Britain was an island surrounded by ocean, and its population depended heavily on supplies arriving from overseas. Food, fuel, steel, aircraft parts, vehicles, and ammunition all had to travel thousands of miles by ship before reaching British ports. Without these supplies, the country could not sustain its civilian population or continue fighting the war. When the war began, German leaders understood this vulnerability very clearly. If the flow of ships across the Atlantic could be reduced enough, Britain would eventually face a severe shortage of essential goods. Factories would slow down, the military would struggle to maintain equipment, and food supplies for civilians would begin to shrink. The entire British war effort depended on keeping those sea lanes open. The convoy system was created as a way to protect merchant ships from submarine attacks. Instead of sailing individually across the ocean, dozens of cargo ships would travel together in a tight formation. Escort vessels, usually destroyers or smaller warships, would patrol around the convoy, watching for submarines and attempting to defend the merchant ships if an attack occurred. The idea behind convoys was simple. A group of ships protected by escorts would be harder for submarines to destroy than isolated vessels traveling alone. Escorts could use sonar to listen for submarines beneath the surface and drop depth charges if they detected one nearby. They could also chase away submarines that surfaced too close to the convoy. But in practice, the system was far from perfect during the early years of the war. The number of available escort ships was limited, and the Atlantic Ocean was vast. Now a convoy might contain 40 or 50 merchant ships, but it might be guarded by only a handful of escort vessels. When a wolf pack of several submarines attacked at once, those escorts could quickly become overwhelmed. U-boats often struck during the night when visibility was poor and confusion spread easily among the ships. In the darkness, escort crews struggled to identify exactly where the submarines were attacking from. Torpedoes could suddenly appear from multiple directions, and striking ships before the escorts could react. Fires erupted across the convoy as damaged vessels burned or began to sink. For the sailors aboard the merchant ships, these attacks were terrifying experiences. A peaceful ocean crossing could suddenly transform into chaos within minutes. Explosions shook the ships. Alarms sounded across the decks, and crews rushed toward lifeboats as flames spread across the water. Despite these dangers, the convoys had to keep sailing. Every shipment crossing the Atlantic was essential for Britain's survival. The war effort depended on those ships reaching their destination. But as U-boat attacks intensified and losses increased, it became clear that defending the convoys alone might not be enough to win the Battle of the Atlantic. The Allies would eventually realize they needed a new strategy, one that did not simply defend the ships, but actively hunted the submarines threatening them. By 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached one of its most dangerous moments. German U-boat commanders were achieving some of their greatest successes, and the ocean seemed increasingly unsafe for Allied shipping. Convoys were still sailing across the Atlantic, but the losses were mounting, and every month brought new reports of merchant ships destroyed by submarine attacks. One of the most shocking developments occurred along the eastern coast of the United States. After America entered the war, German submarines moved closer to the American shoreline, targeting ships traveling along busy coastal routes. Tankers carrying oil and cargo vessels transporting military supplies became easy targets. At night, the lights of cities along the coast sometimes silhouetted ships against the horizon, making them even easier for submarines to spot. The attacks were devastating. Ships were torpedoed within sight of American beaches, and burning tankers drifted across the water while survivors struggled to escape the flames. Some explosions were so powerful that they could be seen from the shore, and in several cases local residents watched helplessly as ships sank just a few miles from land. For German U-boat commanders, this period became known as a time of extraordinary opportunity. They referred to it as the second happy time. Convoys along the American coast were poorly organized at first, and many ships sailed independently without strong escort protection. Submarine captains often reported sinking multiple vessels during a single patrol. The success of these attacks reinforced the belief among German naval leaders that their strategy was working exactly as planned. If enough ships could be destroyed, the flow of supplies reaching Britain and Allied forces in Europe would begin to collapse. Meanwhile, the Allied nations were struggling to keep their shipping routes open. Merchant ship losses during this period were alarmingly high. Cargo vessels carrying vital war materials were disappearing across the Atlantic faster than they could be replaced. Factories in North America were producing enormous quantities of weapons, vehicles, and equipment for the war effort. But those supplies had little value unless they could reach the battlefronts in Europe and other parts of the world. Every ship lost in the Atlantic represented not just the destruction of a vessel, but also the loss of the cargo it carried. As the months passed, it became clear that the Battle of the Atlantic was not simply another naval campaign. It was a struggle that could determine the outcome of the entire war. If the submarines succeeded in cutting the supply lines between North America and Britain, Allied forces would face enormous difficulties continuing the fight against Germany. But while U-boat commanders celebrated their victories during this dangerous year, the Allies were quietly preparing a response. Naval engineers, scientists, and commanders were working together to develop new technologies and new tactics that would soon transform the Atlantic battlefield. And when those changes finally arrived, the submarines that once hunted freely across the ocean would find themselves facing a very different kind of war. While German U-boat commanders celebrated their growing success in the Atlantic, Allied naval leaders were quietly studying every submarine attack in careful detail. Each convoy battle, each lost ship, and each survivor's report provided clues about how the U-boats were operating. Slowly, the Allies began to understand that defeating the submarines would require more than simply adding more escort ships to convoys. The entire system of detecting and fighting submarines had to evolve. One of the most important developments came from improvements in technology. Early in the war, detecting a submarine was extremely difficult, especially at night. U-boats often surfaced after sunset because their diesel engines allowed them to move faster on the surface than underwater. In darkness, submarines could approach convoys almost invisibly. Escorts struggled to detect them until torpedoes were already in the water, but new radar systems began changing that advantage. Improved radar equipment allowed Allied ships and aircraft to detect submarines on the ocean surface, even in darkness or bad weather. A submarine that once relied on the night to hide could suddenly appear clearly on a radar screen miles away. This technology gave escort ships precious time to react before a submarine could reach torpedo range. At the same time, sonar systems used by escort vessels were becoming more effective. The sonar allowed ships to send sound waves into the water and listen for echoes bouncing back from submerged submarines. Although early sonar had limitations, continuous improvements made it increasingly useful for tracking underwater targets. Aircraft also began playing a much larger role in the Atlantic War. Long-range patrol aircraft could search enormous areas of ocean, scanning for submarines traveling on the surface. When a U-boat was spotted, and the aircraft could attack directly or radio nearby naval forces to intercept the submarine. These changes began altering the balance of the battle. U-boats that once moved freely across the Atlantic now faced increasing danger whenever they surfaced. Aircraft patrols forced many submarines to spend longer periods underwater, where their batteries limited speed and endurance. Escort ships equipped with better radar and sonar could react faster when attacks began. However, even these improvements did not immediately end the submarine threat. Convoys were still being attacked, and U-boats continued sinking ships across the Atlantic. The war at sea remained dangerous and unpredictable. Allied commanders gradually realized something important. Simply defending convoys was not enough. As long as submarines could patrol the ocean freely, they would continue searching for opportunities to strike. If the Allies truly wanted to win the Battle of the Atlantic, they needed a new approach, one that would turn the tables on the submarines themselves. Instead of waiting for U-boats to attack convoys, the Allies began preparing a strategy that would send specialized naval forces into the ocean with a different mission. Their mission was not to defend merchant ships. Their mission was to hunt the hunters. The idea that began to reshape the Battle of the Atlantic was both simple and revolutionary. For most of the war up to that point, Allied naval forces had operated defensively. Escort ships stayed close to merchant convoys, reacting only when submarines attacked. The initiative belonged to the U-boats. They chose when and where to strike, and the escorts could only respond after the danger had already appeared. Allied commanders decided that this had to change, and instead of waiting for submarines to attack, they would begin actively searching for them. Special naval task forces were created with a new purpose: find U-boats and destroy them before they could reach the convoys. These task forces became known as hunter-killer groups. A typical hunter-killer group was built around an escort aircraft carrier. Unlike the large fleet carriers used in major naval battles, escort carriers were smaller ships designed specifically for anti-submarine operations. They carried aircraft that could patrol wide areas of ocean, searching for submarines that surfaced to recharge their batteries. Around the escort carrier sailed several destroyers or escort ships equipped with radar, sonar, and depth charges. Together, these ships formed a mobile hunting force, capable of scanning enormous stretches of the Atlantic. Aircraft played a crucial role in this new strategy. When a submarine surfaced during the night or early morning, that patrol aircraft could detect it with radar. Once spotted, the aircraft would attack immediately or radio the submarine's position to the destroyers below. The destroyers would then move in quickly. Using sonar to track the submarine beneath the water, they would drop patterns of depth charges designed to explode at specific depths. These explosions created powerful shock waves in the ocean, capable of damaging or destroying submarines hidden far below the surface. For the first time in the war, the submarines themselves had become the primary targets. Hunter-killer groups did not wait near convoys. Instead, they patrolled areas where U-boats were known to operate. Their mission was to force submarines into defensive positions, preventing them from reaching the shipping lanes in the first place. This new strategy changed the nature of the Atlantic War almost immediately. Submarine commanders who had once approached convoys with confidence now faced the constant possibility that aircraft might suddenly appear overhead, or destroyers might already be searching for them beneath the waves. The ocean that once served as a vast hiding place for U-boats was beginning to fill with enemies actively looking for them. And as hunter-killer groups grew more experienced, the Atlantic was becoming a far more dangerous place for the submarines that once believed they ruled it. Once hunter-killer groups began operating across the Atlantic, the experience of a U-boat patrol started to change in ways German commanders had not expected. For years, submarine captains had believed the ocean itself protected them. The Atlantic was enormous, and a submarine hidden beneath the waves could disappear into thousands of square miles of empty water. But the new combination of aircraft, radar, sonar, and coordinated naval forces was slowly stripping away that advantage. And U-boats depended heavily on surfacing during the night. Their diesel engines could recharge the submarine's batteries and allow it to travel faster across the surface. In the early years of the war, darkness made these operations relatively safe. Submarines could approach convoys, position themselves carefully, and launch attacks without being easily detected. Now the night was no longer a guarantee of safety. My Allied aircraft equipped with radar could detect a submarine even in darkness or heavy cloud cover. A U-boat commander who surfaced to recharge batteries might suddenly hear the roar of aircraft engines overhead. In many cases, the warning came only seconds before bombs or rockets struck the water around the submarine. If the aircraft managed to transmit the submarine's location, destroyers from nearby hunter-killer groups would quickly converge on the area, and once the submarine submerged to escape the aircraft, the destroyers would begin searching with sonar. The submarine crew could hear the steady ping of sonar signals echoing through the water, each sound revealing that enemy ships were tracking them from above. What followed was often a long and terrifying struggle beneath the ocean. Destroyers would release patterns of depth charges designed to explode around the submarine. Each explosion sent shock waves through the water, shaking the submarine's hull and knocking equipment loose inside the vessel. Lights flickered, gauges rattled, and sometimes pipes or electrical systems were damaged by the blast. Submarine crews often remained silent and motionless while the attack continued. The captain would try to maneuver deeper into the ocean, hoping the destroyers would lose contact and eventually abandon the search. But, with improved sonar and coordinated tactics, hunter-killer groups were becoming increasingly skilled at maintaining contact with their targets. For the first time in the war, many submarine commanders began realizing that the balance of power in the Atlantic was shifting. A patrol that once focused on hunting convoys now required constant caution, simply to avoid being detected. The ocean that had once been a hunter's territory was gradually becoming a battlefield filled with dangers for the submarines themselves. And with every month that passed, the number of U-boats that failed to return from patrol continued to rise. By 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached a moment that many historians now describe as the turning point of the entire campaign. For several years, German U-boats had inflicted heavy losses on Allied shipping, and there were moments when the outcome of the struggle seemed uncertain. But the introduction of new technologies, improved convoy defenses, and the aggressive tactics of hunter-killer groups were beginning to change the balance of the war at sea. The change first became visible in the growing number of submarines being destroyed. U-boats that once returned from patrol with stories of burning convoys were now sending increasingly desperate reports back to German command. Aircraft appeared suddenly over the ocean where submarines had once surfaced safely. Escort ships equipped with improved sonar could track submarines for hours, sometimes forcing them to remain underwater until their batteries were nearly exhausted. Then depth charge attacks were becoming more accurate and more relentless. Losses within the German submarine fleet began rising sharply. During certain months of 1943, several U-boats were destroyed in rapid succession. Some were caught by aircraft while recharging batteries on the surface. Others were tracked for long periods by destroyers and eventually destroyed by depth charges. A number of submarines simply vanished during patrols, leaving no survivors and no clear explanation of what had happened. For Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of Germany's submarine forces, the situation was becoming deeply concerning. The strategy that had once seemed so effective was now producing heavy casualties among his crews. Submarines were still capable of sinking ships, but the cost of each patrol was rising steadily. Convoys were becoming harder to penetrate. Improved radar systems meant escorts could detect submarines earlier, and aircraft extended the range of protection far beyond what escort ships alone could provide. Hunter-killer groups actively searched the ocean for submarines, preventing them from operating freely along the main shipping routes. The Atlantic was becoming crowded with Allied ships and aircraft working together to defend the convoys. By the middle of 1943, the scale of the losses forced German naval leaders to make a difficult decision. The several U-boat patrols were temporarily withdrawn from the North Atlantic in an attempt to reduce casualties and reconsider strategy. It was a remarkable moment in the campaign. The submarines that had once threatened to cut the Atlantic lifeline were being pushed back by the very forces they once hunted. The Battle of the Atlantic was far from over, but the momentum had clearly shifted. For the first time in the war, it was becoming clear that the Allied strategy of combining technology, the air power, and coordinated naval forces was beginning to defeat the submarine threat, and the hunters of the Atlantic were now fighting simply to survive. By the later stages of World War II, The Atlantic Ocean had become a very different battlefield from the one German U-boat commanders had known at the beginning of the conflict. The submarines that once roamed the ocean with confidence now faced a constant and growing danger. Allied ships and aircraft were no longer simply defending convoys. They were actively searching for submarines wherever they might be hiding. Hunter-killer groups had transformed the nature of the war at sea. The escort carriers launched aircraft that could patrol vast areas of ocean, scanning the surface with radar and watching for the faint silhouette of a submarine. Destroyers equipped with improved sonar hunted beneath the waves, tracking the slightest sound that might reveal a submerged vessel. When a submarine was detected, the response was swift and coordinated. Aircraft attacked from above, while destroyers closed in from the surface. Depth charges exploded through the water, as submarines tried desperately to escape into the darkness below. In many cases, the submarines had little room to maneuver. If their batteries ran low or damage forced them to surface, Allied ships were often waiting nearby. The losses among the German submarine fleet became severe. Many of the experienced commanders who had once terrorized Allied convoys were lost, along with their crews and vessels. New submarines continued to be built, but the training and experience required to operate them effectively could not be replaced easily. Meanwhile, the Allied convoys continued crossing the Atlantic in growing numbers. Food, fuel, and military supplies flowed steadily from North America to Britain and onward to the battlefields of Europe. The shipping lanes that Germany had once hoped to control were now protected by a powerful network of ships, aircraft, and coordinated naval tactics. The Battle of the Atlantic had revealed an important lesson about modern warfare. Control of the sea was not determined by one powerful weapon or a single brilliant strategy. It depended on adaptation. The side that learned faster, improved technology more quickly, and coordinated its forces more effectively would ultimately gain the advantage. In the early years of the war, U-boats had appeared unstoppable, and their commanders believed the Atlantic belonged to them, and that convoys were vulnerable targets waiting to be destroyed. But the Allies had adapted. Radar, sonar, long-range aircraft, escort carriers, and hunter-killer groups had gradually turned the tide. The ocean that once protected the submarines had become a battlefield filled with enemies searching for them. And by the end of the war, the hunters who once ruled the Atlantic had discovered a harsh truth. They had become the hunted. Upload kit BFU. Here is the complete upload kit for this video. Arrange the way strong WW2 documentary channels package their videos so it fits naturally into the same homepage ecosystem you analyzed.